Tanner Kensington swore under his breath as his luxury car sputtered to a stop on the side of a deserted country road. He glanced at the fuel gauge empty. How had he been so distracted that he hadn't noticed? Probably because he was too busy making billion-dollar decisions over the phone, dealing with corporate mergers, and fending off executives who thought they could outmaneuver him. He was a man who controlled everything except, apparently, the amount of gas in his own car. Stepping out, he surveyed his surroundings. A long stretch of road, flanked by fields and towering trees with not a single sign of civilization in sight. He ran a hand through his thick, dark hair, exhaling sharply. This was unacceptable. He was supposed to be in New York by nightfall, not stranded in the middle of nowhere. A faint rumble in the distance caught his attention. A battered red pickup truck was approaching, kicking up dust as it rolled toward him. He straightened, preparing himself to negotiate his way out of this mess. The truck slowed to a stop, and the driver's side door swung open. A woman stepped out, wiping her hands on a rag. She wore worn jeans and a fitted white t-shirt, her auburn hair pulled into a messy ponytail. She wasn't conventionally polished, but there was something striking about her. Confident, unapologetic. She crossed her arms, eyeing him with a mix of curiosity and amusement. "Let me guess," she said, tilting her head. "City boy got himself stranded in the middle of nowhere." Tanner bristled at the remark but forced a neutral expression. "I ran out of gas," he admitted, his voice smooth and controlled. "Would you happen to know where the nearest gas station is?" She let out a small chuckle. "You're about 10 miles from town, walking there in those shoes." She glanced down at his expensive Italian loafers. "Not gonna happen." He resisted the urge to roll his eyes. "I'll pay you for a ride," he offered, "whatever price you name." She raised an eyebrow. "I don't take money from strangers." "Then consider it a favor," he said, his patience thinning. She studied him for a moment, as if trying to decide whether he was worth the trouble. Then she sighed. "Fine, hop in." Tanner hesitated for a split second before stepping toward the truck. The interior smelled like coffee and vanilla, a stark contrast to the leather and cologne scent of his usual rides. As he settled into the passenger seat, she started the engine. "Name's Josie, by the way," she said, glancing at him as she pulled back onto the road. "And you are?" "Tanner Kensington." Her hands tightened on the wheel for a fraction of a second before she let out a low whistle. "Kensington, as in Kensington Enterprises." He nodded, used to the reaction. "Well, well," Josie mused, a teasing lilt to her voice. "A millionaire stuck in my town. That's a first." Tanner smirked. "I suppose I should be grateful that you stopped." "Darn right you should be." She shot him a grin before turning her attention back to the road. The drive into town was short, but Tanner found himself oddly intrigued by Josie. She was refreshingly direct, unfiltered in a way that most people in his world weren't. When they arrived at the local gas station, she pulled up to the pump and hopped out. "I'll grab the gas can from the back," she said. Tanner followed her, watching as she lifted a red gas canister from the truck bed. "You really didn't have to go out of your way," he admitted, feeling an unusual sense of gratitude. Josie shrugged. "Not every day get to rescue a Kensington." He exhaled a soft laugh, shaking his head. "I suppose I owe you one." "Yeah, you do," she said, handing him the can. "And I collect on favors." For the first time in a long while, Tanner felt something unexpected, a flicker of curiosity, of something that wasn't purely transactional. And that was dangerous. Tanner watched as Josie filled the red gas can, her movements efficient, practiced. She had the look of someone who knew her way around hard work, unlike the polished socialites he was used to dealing with. He couldn't remember the last time someone had helped him without expecting something in return. Josie capped the can and handed it over. "All right, let's get you back to your fancy car before someone mistakes it for abandoned treasure." He took the can, their fingers brushing for the briefest second. Tanner ignored the flicker of awareness that shot through him. Efficient and charitable. Do you run the town's rescue service? She let out a short laugh as she opened the truck door. Not officially, but I guess I have a habit of picking up strays. Tanner climbed into the passenger seat, setting the can between them. Lucky me. They drove back down the quiet stretch of road, the hum of the engine filling the silence. Tanner found himself studying her out of the corner of his eye. There was an ease to the way she handled the truck, a quiet confidence that made her seem entirely at home in her surroundings. It was a stark contrast to the relentless pace of his own life. "You don't get many city types out here, do you?" he asked. She shook her head. "Not unless they are lost or running from something." "Which do you think I am?" She glanced at him, amusement dancing in her eyes. "Haven't decided yet." They pulled up beside his stranded car, and Josie hopped out first, grabbing the gas can before he could. Tanner followed, watching as she expertly poured the fuel into the tank. "You do this often?" he asked. "Small town life," she said with a shrug. "You learn how to take care of things yourself." Something about that struck him. In his world, people paid others to handle their problems. Here, Josie just did what needed to be done. She handed the empty can back to him. "Try starting it up." Tanner slid into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine roared to life. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding before stepping out again. "Looks like I owe you more than one favor now." Josie leaned against her truck, arms crossed. "I'll keep that in mind." He pulled out his wallet, intent on handing her a few crisp bills, but her expression darkened before he even spoke. "Don't insult me," she said. Tanner hesitated. "It's not an insult, it's gratitude." She shook her head. "If I wanted payment, I would have asked for it." He slid the wallet back into his pocket, studying her. She wasn't playing a game. She genuinely didn't want anything from him. That was rare in his world. Josie pushed off the truck. "Well, Millionaire, looks like your crisis is solved." He wasn't ready for the conversation to end. He wasn't sure why. "Let me take you to dinner." She raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "You asking me out?" "Consider it part of the favor, oh." She seemed to weigh the offer before nodding. "All right, but don't think a fancy meal is gonna impress me." Tanner grinned. "We'll see about that." As she climbed into her truck and drove away, Tanner realized something unsettling. He was looking forward to seeing her again. And that was dangerous. Tanner arrived at Josie's farmhouse just before sunset, pulling up the long gravel driveway in his now fully fueled car. The golden light stretched across the fields, casting everything in a warm glow. He wasn't sure what he expected, but the sight of her home, a charming, slightly worn white house with a wraparound porch, was unexpectedly grounding. It was the kind of place that had history, where people stayed for generations. The complete opposite of his sleek Manhattan penthouse that felt more. Josie stood on the porch, leaning against the railing as she watched him park. She had changed into a sundress, blue and simple, yet somehow more striking than any designer gown he'd seen at the high-profile galas he attended. She exuded a natural elegance, effortless and entirely her own. "I half expected you to cancel," she said as he approached. "I don't cancel," he replied. She eyed him, as if measuring the truth in his words, before nodding toward the truck parked beside her house. "We're taking my ride." Tanner looked at the truck, aging, worn, but clearly well cared for. "You don't think my car is good enough?" She grinned. "I think your car belongs on a city street, not bouncing down dirt roads." He huffed a quiet laugh and followed her to the truck. The inside smelled faintly of lavender and something sweeter, like honey. It was a stark contrast to the usual leather and polish scent of his own vehicles. As they drove, Josie tapped her fingers against the steering wheel, her gaze focused on the open road ahead. Tanner realized he wasn't used to being the passenger. He was always in control, always the one making decisions. But with Josie, there was no power struggle, no agenda. Just a quiet, steady confidence in the way she carried herself. They pulled into the parking lot of a small diner, a neon sign flickering above the entrance. Inside, the place was bustling with locals, the kind of people who probably had dinner here every night and knew each other's names. Tanner was used to high-end restaurants where reservations were booked months in advance, where meals were presented like art. But there was something about the warmth of this place that made it feel real. Josie slid into a booth by the window, and Tanner took the seat across from her. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes, greeted Josie like an old friend before turning to him with a curious glance. "You're new," she said. "Just passing through," Tanner replied. Josie smirked, "For now." The waitress chuckled and took their orders, leaving them alone in the comfortable hum of the diner. Tanner leaned back, studying Josie. "So what's your story?" he asked. She raised an eyebrow. "That's a broad question." "You don't strike me as someone who stays in one place because she has to." She exhaled, tapping her fingers against the table. "I left for a while, thought I wanted something different. Lived in Chicago for a couple of years, worked a corporate job. Hated every second of it, so came back." He tilted his head. "What made you hate it?" She hesitated, then shrugged. It wasn't real. Everything felt temporary, like nobody was really living, just existing. Tanner knew that feeling all too well. Before he could respond, their food arrived, and Josie wasted no time digging in. He watched her, amused at how she made no effort to impress him with delicate bites or polite restraint. She was unapologetically herself. "You're staring," she said without looking up. "I'm intrigued." "By what?" He set his fork down. "By the fact that you don't seem to care who I am." She finally met his eyes. "Should I?" Most people did. Most people wanted something from him: connections, influence, money. But Josie treated him like he was just another guy stranded on the side of the road. It was both frustrating and fascinating. "Maybe," he said. She smirked. "You're not used to being told no, are you?" "Not particularly." She laughed, shaking her head. "You really are a city boy." Tanner found himself laughing too, a genuine, unguarded sound that surprised even him. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't thinking about deals or deadlines. He wasn't calculating his next move. He was just there with her, and that was dangerous. Tanner had never felt so out of his element, yet so completely at ease at the same time. Sitting across from Josie in that small-town diner, watching her laugh without restraint, something shifted inside him. It wasn't just the novelty of her honesty or the way she didn't treat him like a man whose net worth could solve any problem. It was the way she made him feel like he wasn't a millionaire first, but just a man. As they finished their meal, the waitress returned with the check. Tanner reached for his wallet, but before he could so much as pull out a bill, Josie slid a few crumpled bills onto the table. He stared at her, caught between amusement and disbelief. "You're paying?" he asked. She leaned back, arms crossed. "You still owe me a favor. This keeps the balance in my favor." Tanner exhaled a quiet laugh. "You really don't care, do you?" "About what?" "That I could buy this entire diner." Josie rolled her eyes. "And yet, you needed me to rescue you on the side of the road. Money doesn't make you invincible, city boy." He watched her for a long moment, something warm settling in his chest. She was different. She saw past the wealth, past the power, and that was rare. They stepped outside, the evening air thick with the scent of summer. Fireflies flickered in the distance, dots of light against the darkening sky. Josie walked ahead toward her truck, but Tanner wasn't ready for the night to end. "Come with me," he said. She turned, one brow raised. Where? He gestured toward his car. Let me show you my world for a change. Josie hesitated. Tanner could see the wheels turning in her head, weighing the risks. Finally, she exhaled and nodded. All right, but if I hate it, I'm walking home. He opened the passenger door for her, and once she was inside, he slid into the driver's seat. The engine purred to life, smooth and effortless. He guided the car down the main street, past quiet storefronts and sleepy neighborhoods, until they reached the outskirts of town. A few miles out, he pulled onto a private road leading to a sprawling estate. Josie sat up straighter. This is where you're staying. For now, he said. The house wasn't ostentatious, at least not by his standards. A modern retreat nestled on a hill with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the countryside. The kind of place designed for escape, not for show. Inside, Tanner led her to the back deck, where an infinity pool stretched toward the horizon. The night sky reflected in the water, stars shimmering in the darkness. Josie let out a low breath. Okay, I'll admit it, this is impressive. He leaned against the railing, watching her take it all in. You were expecting something different. I don't know, she said, turning to face him. Guess, I thought your world was all boardrooms and high rises. That's part of it. He paused, searching for the right words. But I don't really live, not like you do. She held his gaze, something unreadable in her expression. So why do it, if it doesn't make you happy? Tanner exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Because it's what I know, it's what I built. And when you build something that big, walking away isn't an option. Josie studied him for a long moment, then stepped closer. Maybe you don't have to walk away. Maybe you just need to figure out what actually matters. He didn't know how to respond to that, because for the first time in his life, he wasn't entirely sure what mattered anymore. But he knew one thing. He didn't want this night to end. And he didn't want to let her go. Tanner stood at the edge of the infinity pool, arms resting against the railing as he gazed into the night. Behind him, Josie paced slowly along the deck, her bare feet making no sound against the smooth wood. There was something about the stillness between them that felt weighted, like an unspoken conversation neither had quite figured out how to start. She finally stopped beside him, her gaze sweeping over the estate grounds. So what happens when you leave? She asked, her voice quiet but direct. Tanner glanced at her, noting the way her profile was illuminated by the soft glow of the pool lights. You assume I'm leaving. Josie turned to face him fully, arms crossing in a way that suggested she was bracing for the answer. A man like you doesn't stay in a place like this. You've got a whole empire waiting for you. He exhaled slowly, turning his attention back to the stars. She wasn't wrong. His world was built on constant motion, decisions that moved millions, deals that shaped industries. And yet, standing here, none of that felt as pressing as it usually did. I don't know, he admitted. For the first time in a long time, I don't have an answer. Josie let out a quiet breath, and he could sense her considering his words, weighing them against whatever she might have been feeling. After a moment, she stepped away, moving toward the edge of the pool. She dipped a foot into the water, watching the ripples spread outward. You're used to controlling everything, she said, but you can't control this. Tanner pushed away from the railing, walking toward her. And what is this exactly? She looked up, meeting his gaze with something unreadable in her expression. I don't know either. For a man who thrived on certainty, who made decisions in seconds that others agonized over for weeks, the unknown should have unsettled him. But it didn't. It intrigued him. Josie withdrew her foot from the water and stood, brushing her hands down the sides of her dress. It's late, she said. I should probably head back. He knew he should let her go. Let the night end on this quiet, uncertain note, but something inside him refused. Stay, he said, the word slipping out before he could think better of it. She hesitated, eyes searching his as if trying to determine what he really meant. "I don't mean forever," he added, offering a small, almost self-conscious chuckle. "Just for a little longer." Josie studied him, then, after a beat, gave a slight nod. "All right, but I'm not good at sitting still." Tanner gestured toward the lounge chairs positioned along the deck. "Then let's move." They sat, the silence between them no longer heavy with uncertainty, but something else, something that neither of them rushed to define. Tanner leaned back, stretching his legs out in front of him. "Tell me something about you I don't know." Josie tilted her head, thinking, "I used to want to be a pilot." "That was unexpected. What happened?" She exhaled, glancing toward the sky. "Life, money, responsibility. I stayed here instead." He considered that. "Do you regret it?" She was quiet for a moment before shaking her head. "No, but sometimes I wonder." Tanner understood that more than he cared to admit. They sat there for a long time, neither in a rush to fill the silence with unnecessary words. Eventually, Josie yawned, stretching her arms above her head. "That's my cue," she said, standing. Tanner stood with her, resisting the ridiculous urge to prolong the moment. "Let me drive you home." She gave him a look. "I have my truck." "Then let me follow you." Josie huffed a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "You're something else, Kensington." He wasn't sure what that meant, but he found that he didn't mind. And as he watched her walk toward her truck, a thought settled into his chest. Maybe, for the first time in his life, he wasn't the one making the decisions. Maybe, this time, he was letting something real take the lead. Tanner followed Josie's truck down the winding country roads, his headlights illuminating the path ahead. The night air was crisp, the scent of fresh earth and distant rain filling his car as he drove. He wasn't sure what had compelled him to insist on following her home, only that the thought of letting her disappear into the night without knowing when he'd see her again didn't sit right. When they reached her farmhouse, she pulled into the driveway and climbed out of her truck. Tanner parked beside her, stepping out into the quiet night. The sky overhead was vast and endless, unbroken by city lights, the stars shining with a clarity he rarely got to witness. Josie leaned against the side of her truck, arms crossed. "You really didn't have to follow me all the way here." "I wanted to," Tanner said simply. She exhaled, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "You're not used to leaving things unfinished, are you?" He considered that. "No, but this doesn't feel finished." For a long moment, she just looked at him, as though trying to decipher something unspoken between them. Then, without a word, she turned and made her way up the porch steps. Tanner hesitated only briefly before following. Inside, her home was warm and lived in, with shelves lined with books, worn furniture that had clearly been loved over the years, and a faint scent of lavender lingering in the air. It was a stark contrast to the pristine, museum-like quality of his penthouse, and he found himself appreciating the difference. Josie moved to the kitchen, pulling open a cabinet and retrieving two mismatched mugs. "If you're staying a little longer, you're getting coffee." Tanner leaned against the counter, watching as she moved with ease, pouring steaming liquid into the cups and sliding one toward him. He took it, the heat grounding him in a way he hadn't expected. She took a sip of her own before finally speaking again. "What happens when you go back to your world?" Tanner tightened his grip around the mug. "I don't know." Josie set her cup down, her gaze steady. "You're not the kind of man who doesn't have a plan." He exhaled, knowing she was right. His entire life had been structured around strategy, around control. But she had disrupted that, made him question things he had never allowed himself to before. "I don't want this to end," he admitted. A flicker of something passed through her eyes, something soft and hesitant. "But it has to, doesn't it?" Tanner shook his head. Not if we don't want it to. She studied him for a long moment, then set her coffee aside. You don't understand how different our lives are. Then help me understand, Tanner said, stepping closer. Because all I know is that I haven't felt like this in a long time. Josie let out a slow breath, her resolve wavering. You don't belong here, Tanner. And maybe don't want to belong anywhere else, he countered. The silence between them was thick, charged with something neither of them could ignore. Finally, Josie reached for his hand, her fingers curling around his. It was a small gesture, but it was enough. Tanner lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss against her knuckles. Let me prove to you that this doesn't have to end. She didn't pull away. Instead, she nodded, the barest hint of a smile playing on her lips. And for the first time in his life, Tanner Kensington was willing to change the course of everything he had built for something real, for something worth holding onto. For her,